ask you one of those questions. I know, I heard that. Because you got a whole bunch of kids.
Hey everybody, please remember your field trip rules. This chat is going to be a professional chat. Please, you will end up getting removed if you are going to stay inappropriate. We will be taking attendance throughout this, so please make sure that you guys are being appropriate. And we will be starting in 1 minute.
Down there.
Down there.
I thought so.
It's a, you think it's a buck rub?
All right, welcome everybody, and I hope that you guys are going to enjoy today's virtual field trip to Cypress Creek Natural Area. I am Miss McGill from Palm Springs Middle School, and joining us is also going to be Miss Carbonin from Palm Springs Middle School, and we are going to be moderating in the back. So if you have questions as you're going throughout this field trip, please type in your questions in the chat. ERM is here to go ahead and answer any questions you guys have while we're going through this. You guys are pretty much driving this field trip, so you guys are in the driver's seat. Any questions that you guys ask, they will go ahead and they will answer. And if you could really quick, just let us know what school you guys are from, and say hi to us. And we're gonna go ahead and get the field trip going. So Benji, over to you.
All right. Thank you, Heather. I'm with Palm Beach County's Environmental Resources Management. For the past 5 years, I work with our outreach team, events and things like this. But before that, I did wetland restoration, I did prescribed fire and biological monitoring. And outside of work, I'm an absolute travel junkie with my wife. We travel a ton around the state and across the country. I do some conservation photography, and we are going to explore one of my favorite habitats in Florida. It's one that gets such a bad rap, but it is the Cypress Swamp, and just swamps in general. So what you see behind us right here is more of this freshwater ephemeral marsh. We're going to go put our feet in there. I also wanted to introduce Alicia, if you could come over real quick. That way we don't have to move the camera. So this is Alicia Anderson. We're going to try to maintain our distance apart here. But like Heather said, Miss McGill said, these field trips, the reason that they're interesting and exciting is because of you all. And it's the questions that you bring along the way. With these field trips, we don't plan out a whole lot. We kind of just want to go explore and see what we see along the way and really see where your interest leads us. So like she said, please interact, ask questions about what you're seeing, and forgive the video if it buffers a little bit. We are out here in the swamp, you know, we are not in a building with Wi-Fi. So give it a chance if the video buffers or the audio just skips a little bit, and hopefully it'll come back, or if we get kicked off, we'll sign right back on. So one of the things that we like to do to try to make sure that we can find some animals to talk about when we're out here doing these field trips is set up some traps. So while we're on dry land here, I want to introduce you guys to what we've used to try to put some critters in our hands today. And so Alicia is bringing this over, and this is, you're gonna, if you follow along with us this year, you're gonna be familiar with these. These are our minnow traps, okay? And it's just wire mesh, and it has a funnel on the side that allows these fish and whatever else to come in, but then they can't get back out. They can't find their way back out. So we set these up about a day in advance to monitor what we have in here. We'll just remove the clip, and this thing comes right apart, and we can check out our critters. So you guys will be seeing this a lot. This is what we use to go fishing and to find what is in these habitats that we can't see. Because if you come out here and you just kind of take a look around, you don't see that much. But that's so deceptive because these habitats are full of life. Right now, if you guys can hear it on the audio, I'm not sure if you can, but we're hearing cicadas, we're hearing different birds. So there's so much life out here. You just have to know where to look to find it. So Sam, if we could come down over here, this is what we're going to be looking at when we put our traps, or hopefully what we catch in the traps, into these acrylic boxes. So hopefully we can show you all, you know, what we have here. So with that, Alicia, do you want to head over into freshwater marsh first?
With a
Yeah, with the empty acrylic.
okay.
So we're going to be in the cypress swamp later. That is absolutely my favorite habitat in Florida. But first we're going to go into the marsh. And the marsh is this more open habitat, more herbaceous vegetation, this grassy vegetation. And this is what we call an ephemeral wetland. So I'm not sure that it dries out and then refills with water. So it changes based on the season.
Benji, really quickly, what are the most common fish in this area? And are there gators out there with you guys?
Okay, so answer to two questions. I'm going to answer the easiest question first. Yes, there are alligators out here. So this is a common thing that people ask. It's like when my sister comes and visits me and we go snorkeling, we'll go out in the ocean and she'll say, "Are there sharks here?" And I say, "Of course there are sharks here. It's the ocean." So we're in Florida, okay? Pretty much any freshwater body that you come into contact with, there's a good likelihood that alligators are there, or move through there at different times of the year, okay? So I think the last thing I read was that there's, I believe, over 1 million alligators in the state of Florida, population-wise. Okay, that is a lot of big lizards. So yes, there are alligators out here, and no, I don't have issues with alligators when I go tromping in the swamp. And I don't do this once a month on these field trips. I do it all the time on the weekends for fun. So it's really about, when you enter these habitats, it's about making sure you educate yourself so you know what to look for. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we kind of walk through the wetlands. What am I looking for to make sure that we're safe and that's the easy question. Yes, there are alligators out here. The most common fish that we're going to see out here in these wetlands are probably fish that you guys don't know or haven't heard of. They're things like mosquito fish and flagfish and golden top minnows. There's a bunch of different kinds of sunfish. So those are good panfish you may have caught, you know, going fishing with your folks. Occasionally we'll see largemouth bass, but those are probably a little too big to fit into our minnow traps, right? So Alicia, let's head in here to the marsh and we'll see what we find.
All right, when you say panfish, does that mean you put it in a pan and cook it?
Cook it in a pan. That's how they got their name, panfish.
All right.
All right, so Samantha's
Hey, is
going to
this
follow.
area very similar to the Everglades, Benji?
Right. So it is pretty similar, yes. And we're going to go get out into the marsh, and then we'll talk about that a little bit. But Sam, you can kind of show my feet and how. So I know the video is going to be a little crummy while we're moving here. We're not going to move far today. Just keep on coming, Sam. So the question was, is this area similar to the Everglades? And the answer is yes. You know, what the Everglades is really is exactly what it's called, which is the river of grass, right? And it's called the river of grass because it is a very, very slow moving slough system, essentially. where very shallow water moves through grassy habitats, just like are behind me. So what's behind me is predominantly a plant called spike rush, and that is found in the Everglades. The dominant plant you'll find in the Everglades is sawgrass. We do have that in different places out here. And interspersed within these vast regions of sawgrass and spike rush marsh are these cypress domes, which we're going to explore next. And so during the wet season, which we're in right now, obviously, water levels come up. And this is when the river of grass and all of these wetlands really get their water. They get this growth spurt. All of these plants are growing. The fish are happy because there's so much habitat for them. They can multiply and reproduce. So all of this life is churning here. And Sam, if we can come over here, I want to see if you guys can see some of these fish. So,
please contact the main office.
Oh, that was an announcement. Sorry. All right. So they just hid. There's some over here. So I'm not sure if you guys can see these tiny little fish moving over here. So these are some of these really, really common fish species in the marsh, and these are called mosquito fish. And true to their name, they do eat mosquito larvae. They eat a lot of other different kinds of larvae and small, tiny little animals. And they will colonize these wetlands really, really quickly when they fill back up with water. So that's one of the most common fish that we'll see out here is mosquito fish. So let's swing over and see if we've got anything in our trap over here. And I want to just kind of explain what I'm feeling and everything since you guys can't be here with me. So we just came into the sun and almost immediately I felt my feet warm up. So this water
Benji, they'd like to know how deep that water is.
So right now, you know.
Benji, your audio is going in and out.
So, all right. So how are we doing now? Can you hear me now?
Now you're good. Now you're good.
Okay, good. So this is kind of how we set up these traps, guys. And we're going to see if we got anything in here. And I can tell you that it has been kind of a slow fishing day here. But we've got a few things in the trap.
Okay, I'm ready with the bubbler.
All right. So let's see what we got. Now, if you all follow along with us, when we fish in the future, we are going to see a lot more than what is in here right now. So, come on, beetle. There we go.
What about that thing?
And come on. So this is really interesting. All right. All right, so you can step back, Alicia.
I will.
And what we've got here, guys,
Pinchers.
does anybody know what this is?
Anybody have any guesses? They also want to know what the size of that natural area is. So you have a guess of a lobster?
Ah, close. This is our little freshwater lobster. This is a crayfish. Okay. And so they look just like lobster. He's got his claws there. He's pinching me. So crayfish are one of these quintessential swamp critters. They live in the mud. They use their little pinchers here to eat detritus, eat tiny little animals, eat fish if they can get their little pinchers on them. So this is an awesome find, and it's telling us that our system is healthy here. Now, I mentioned that if you stick around on field trips to come, that we're going to catch a lot more than we're catching right now. We will pull up traps that are full of fish.
All right, so Benji, right now there's a bunch.
is I literally
Benji, there's a bunch of conversation about crayfish, crawdad. So what exactly is the difference between a crayfish, a crawdad, a crawfish?
okay. So there's no difference, and so a crayfish and a crawdad are the same thing, and they're just called different things in different regions. And so when you get into kind of the deep south and in places like New Orleans, you'll hear them called crawdads, right? Or crawfish. Here in Florida, and you get a little further up north, and people call them crayfish. And a lot of people, this is kind of a delicacy. Though, a lot of people eat these. That tail, just like a lobster, has just unbelievably delicious meat in it. The other thing you're seeing right here, okay, this guy here that is Sam's focusing on, that is what's called a predatory diving beetle. And those things are one of the fiercest predators in the swamp, in the marsh, those predatory diving beetles. So
swimming legs.
Right, their mouth parts have essentially something that will inject venom into. That's how they feed. Those are one of the things that can actually give you a little bit of a sting here in the swamp. One of the few things that might,
that you won't pick up.
give you a little.
They're asking all about.
Yeah, I'm not going to pick him up. Asking about
They're
what?
asking about the food chain. They're asking about the food chain for both of those critters right there. They want to know what eats both of those. What do they eat?
So, so if you guys can just let me slide past here. Again, with these animals here, the crayfish is really, when it gets lucky and can actually get those pinchers on a fish, that's like caviar for it, right? But mostly what that crayfish is eating is essentially detritus on the bottom. It's decaying plant matter, and it's filtering through and feeding and pulling whatever nutrients it can out of that. That predatory diving beetle, that guy is like the lion of the underwater swamp. So predatory diving beetles and dragonfly nymphs, so the nymph form of a dragonfly, are really some of the top predators as far as bugs in the swamp. So, those are eating smaller fish. They're eating smaller insects that they can find. A lot of insects will start their life in the water. And then we've got a fish over here that looks like maybe some kind of a sunfish. And
Benji,
so
they want to know if the animals change.
Again,
Benji, they want to know if the amount of
what?
animals change during the seasons. Do the amount of animals change during the seasons?
So absolutely they do. And just to finish off on that food chain thought, I think, Alicia, you could probably put that down. I know that's getting heavy. To finish off on the food chain thought, and then we'll talk about populations. What eats these guys? So these guys get hunted and eaten by a lot of different things. Small alligators will eat those little fish and the crayfish if they can find them. Those fish will be eaten by things like snapping turtles and wading birds, okay? Wading birds. So hopefully you guys know what wading birds are. This is kind of like what Florida is famous for bird-wise, is our wading birds. Things like great blue herons and wood storks and great egrets. And so hopefully you guys have seen some of those. And wading birds will forage in these wetland systems, and they will be a predator of everything that's in there. They'll eat those diving beetles. They'll eat the crayfish. They'll eat the small fish. Pretty much anything we catch that a wading bird can fit down his throat. I was really hopeful that we might catch a snake or one of our giant salamander or giant amphibians. We have the two-toed amphiuma and the greater siren, which we actually caught on a field trip last year. So they're essentially salamanders with no legs that are about that long. And wading birds will make a meal out of those if they can get them. So that's kind of where that food chain goes. Now, the question was about population size. So right now, water levels are up, right? We talked about that, and how all of this vegetation, it's getting nutrients from the water that's coming in. And so all the plants are growing. Because of the different space and that plant growth, that's spurring the growth of all the mosquito fish and all these other fish, right? It's just like they went from living in an apartment to living in a mansion. So they can fit way more of them in this habitat. So all these fish are really reproducing. So these populations are going up. What's kind of interesting though is during this time, this is one of the hardest times for those wading birds and those species that eat these fish. Even though the populations are going up, the wading birds have a real hard time actually hunting for these. And that's because these populations, while they're increasing, there's so much real estate, there's so much space that these fish are spread out. And so one of the things, if you all follow along with us, Sam's showing you all the mosquito fish that are in here. Now, we didn't catch those in the trap because they're so small, they just go in and out. So even though we didn't catch much, there are fish all in this wetland. But like I said, there's so much real estate that the wading birds have trouble catching these, especially wading birds, Sam, if you can come up here, like the wood storks and the roseate spoonbills. Okay, so we have our herons and our egrets, and they have these real pointy beaks. And they are gonna actually seek out these fish and stab and grab them. And that's how they hunt. So they actually look for individual fish. If you look at their head straight on, it looks really funny, especially if you look at it from below, because their eyes are set off to the side, and that's so they can see straight below them when they're in the water. But the tactile feeders, the wood storks and the roseate spoonbills, they feed based on feel. They don't actually see their prey. So what they'll do is they'll put their beak in the water, and in the case of the wood stork, he'll just leave it open. Sometimes he'll create shade with his wings by putting his wings out, and the small fish will come in underneath that shade to get out of the hot sun. The roseate spoonbill has its beak looks like a spoon, and it'll put it in the water and sweep back and forth. Both of those birds have incredible sense of touch in their beak, and as soon as they feel something in their beak, they snap it shut, and that's how they feed. In fact, the wood stork has the fastest reaction time of any vertebrate in the animal world, faster than crocodiles, faster than anything. That's how fast from when something touches its beak to when it snaps shut. It's incredible. But because they're tactile feeders, those birds really rely on a big concentration of prey items, all right? So we're going to talk about seasons really quick. So right now, it's the wet season. Lots of real estate, fish populations are going. But we have very few birds that are breeding right now, and that's because food is hard to come by. We get into the dry season, we still have the same fish population, right? It exploded. But as the water draws down in these wetlands, what happens? That real estate gets smaller and smaller and smaller, right? And so instead of having all this room to spread out, all these fish that reproduced and were born during the wet season, they get closer and closer and closer together. And that's what kickstarts the breeding cycle for things like wading birds that feed on these fish. Because essentially what nature is doing is providing this concentrated buffet of food for these birds. So now they can not just feed themselves, but they can raise their young too. So that's a little bit about population. There's another cool thing that we saw over here the other day that I want to show you guys, and then we're going to go ahead into the swamp.
Now, what do you want to do?
All right, Benji, while you're walking, so they want to know what kind of challenges do these animals out here face? And then they would like to also know about the largest predator that's in that area as well.
Okay, all right. So, I just heard something. Okay, so what kind of challenges do these animals face? So animals face challenges, I mean, literally every single day, right? Nature is hard, and that's one of the reasons before we bought it was to use it for houses or use it for cattle farming. Two different things that don't really coincide with a swamp. And so when we bought this property, we had to restore it. So animals face a lot of challenges just from what we have done to nature. And so one of the things that I'm really proud of that ERM does is we try to combat that. We try to restore these lands. That's what the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan is for, CERP. It's trying to essentially undo some of the damage that we have done, and try to develop in a smarter way. So these animals, they face challenges every day from their predators and their competitors, but they also face challenges, from the biggest disruptor, and that is us. And obviously right here, Sam, if you look here, but these are all over. These are apple snail shells. And these guys obviously faced a challenge because only the shell is left. And there's a whole pile of them here. And so this is telling us something.
Benji, are there any species that are close to being endangered as you're continuing to talk about the apple snails?
Right. So that's a perfect segue. Whoever asked that question, you were reading my mind. So these apple snails here, can we get it?
You want to get it in the light?
Get it in the light?
Okay.
These apple snails, this is actually an exotic apple snail. We do have a native here. And we were really, really concerned about 15, 20 years ago because these exotics were coming in. And we weren't sure what Everglades snail kite. The Everglades snail kite at one point was down to a couple dozen pairs that were left in the United States and Florida. And this is a raptor. Okay, a raptor is a predatory bird, and they feed almost exclusively on apple snails. They're specific.
Benji, your audio is cutting out.
Adapted, they have this really hooked beak. We'll send you guys pictures in the follow-up to this of snail kites.
Benji, your audio is really laggy. All right. Hold on, guys. They're going to come back.
All right.
Okay.
Here we are.
Hey,
all right. The audio is still very laggy.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Now I can hear you.
Okay. Okay. That's funny. That was the same exact spot. There's like one dead spot that we lost you the other day. So the Everglades snail kite, it has these adaptations. It feeds on these apple snails. And when humans started draining the Everglades, they were draining the wetlands where these apple snails live. And so these kites just did not have any food source anymore. Now they're one of these restoration success stories. Kites now, there's around 2,000 of these birds in Florida. One of the big reasons for their rebound is this exotic apple snail. This is a lot bigger than our native apple snail. And so those kites with that hooked bill will pry off the trap door, the operculum of these snails, and use that hook to get the meat out. So this apple snail, this exotic apple snail, is much larger, 2 or 3 times as big as our native. And what we biologists were worried about 15 years ago was, are the young snail kites going to be strong enough to actually eat this? So there was a lot of regulations. But then we say we're also having much better nest success because there was more food available because there were these bigger snails. So this is one of the very rare cases where an exotic introduced animal has actually helped the recovery of an endangered species. Now we saw these littered over there in the marsh, and that tells us about another big predator of the swamp. Predator, not big, huge teeth like you think an alligator or something like that, but nonetheless a predator, because there were dozens of these snail shells littered on the ground. And it wasn't above a perch. If it was above one spot, I would think that's probably a snail kite, because they will have these favorite perches in the cypress trees. They'll go back to and back to and back to.
Benji, how
And
do
you'll have
apple
like
snails
this
get their
pile of snails concentrated in one spot.
How did they get their name?
I don't know. I mean, they kind of look like apples, don't they? I'm not sure. But with all these carcasses spread out, that tells us that this was probably a limpkin, which is a wading bird, has long legs, and it has a beak that is slightly curved on the end. You can't really tell, but this is another wading bird that will chomp on these apple snails. So that is probably what all that evidence was in there. Now, we're about halfway done, so we're going to go into my favorite place. We're going to go into the swamp. We're going to check out what's in there. Oh, before we do that, I want to show you what we caught in the swamp. So, like I said, our fishing was not hugely successful, and that's because everything is spread out, right? One of our traps in the swamp had things in it, and I'm going to show you some of those here that we had in the swamp. So here's one of them. Now, this guy looks a little different than that other crayfish, right? Got a lot bigger pinchers, and he's holding on to my little net here. Come on, buddy, let go. I'm trying to let him pinch me, but he doesn't want to. So another crayfish here. And then we've got a better diversity of fish as well. So, Alicia, maybe if you can hold that to get some of the, well, let me see if I can get one of these fish.
Benji, your audio is going in and out.
My favorites.
Can we lift that up?
Yeah, I'm trying to. Can you hear me now?
Are there a lot of invasive
I
species?
see those gold. There are some. So that was one of my favorite fish I wanted to show you guys. It's called a golden top minnow. There are a lot of invasive species, and we're actually going to see some of those invasives when we go into the swamp. But you can see we've just got a few more fish in here than we had in the other one. But like I said, stick around, and in the dry season when we go fishing, we're going to have about 10 or 20 times this many fish. So
Benji, on our side, we're frozen video wise on you guys right now if you're moving around.
Okay, all right, we're going to move into the swamp and see if we can get better signal. We had it the other day.
Benji, you want this, right?
No.
It's a little ironic that we have to go into the swamp to get better signal.
Right? So Heather, let me know if this video comes back. I sure hope it does.
The video came back, but you're still lagging. I think we're good now.
Okay.
All right, good. So we're coming into one of my absolute favorite habitats, and this is the Cypress swamp. And we're going to kind of move a little fast here, so bear with us. We're going to get to a spot where we can just kind of hang out and look around. But I'm sure the video will be lagging a little bit.
All right, while you're walking, we can still hear you. Can you talk about if there's any types of spiders in that area? And then the students were interested in the types of trees in that area as well.
Okay, cool. So absolutely on spiders. There are a ton of different spider species that hang out in habitats like the swamp here. The most dangerous thing, sand spurs that I picked up out on the trail, killing me.
So when you're
So-
walking through that water, Benji, is there a trick to walking through it so you don't get hurt?
Right. Yeah. So you know how they say do the stingray shuffle when you're in the lagoon? What you
Yes.
don't want to do in the swamp is shuffle your feet, because underneath me here is all kinds of stuff. Down sticks, logs. There's a huge log right here that's underneath the water. So when we're in the swamp, we actually want to pick our feet up and put them down. Samantha has a walking stick with her to steady herself because she's looking at the phone and trying to walk at the same time. So the question about spiders. So there are these really cool spiders in the swamp called fishing spiders, and they will walk across the top of the water. They're that light where they can just scoot right across the top of the water. They actually carry a bubble down into the water with them, and they can stay underwater with this little air tank, just like a diver. So just such cool animals. And then you've got, of course, orb weavers that will set up webs between trees like this. So there was a question about spiders, and then the trees that we see here. So Sam's pointing up. In our cypress dome, we are dominated here by cypress trees. Now we have two species of cypress trees here in Florida. One is called a pond cypress, like a pond in your yard. The other one is a bald cypress. In general, now this isn't hard and fast rules, but in general, most of the cypress trees that are in here, in this dome, are pond cypress trees. And that's because pond cypress trees, they like a slower moving water body, right? They like these swamps where the water just kind of comes up and goes down throughout the year. Bald cypress you're going to find in more of a river system with flowing water like the Loxahatchee River, which is only about 1.5 miles to our east. We're coming up to some
Benji, they're starting to notice that water is getting deep. How deep does that water get out there?
Okay, so you can tell right now, and Miss McGill, we did a field trip last year in the same spot, and
Yes.
it was dry where I was standing. Right now, the water's above my knees. It's about 2 feet deep. If I went about 40 yards that way, it would be about shoulder height. I might not be able to stand. So there's a really deep area right in the middle of this. And you kind of can tell, even when the water's this high, where it's getting deeper based on vegetation, right? So I know that if you look over to my right, Sam, and I see all this swamp fern. Now this swamp fern can grow on the side of the cypress trees, but this is obviously grown on the ground. I know that if swamp fern is around, I'm still only a couple of feet deep. Now, if I turn left and look over here, so you guys will notice, see that big, tall green leaf there?
Yeah.
So that is a plant. The genus is Thalia. It's Thalia geniculata. But the common name for that plant is alligator flag. And the reason it's called alligator flag is because it tends to live in even deeper water. So I know that when I go towards this alligator flag, you can see it's getting deeper and deeper. It's getting close to 3 feet deep here. It's up on my thigh. And the reason I call this alligator flag is because when you get a big thick stand of this, like is over there, when an alligator moves through this, because an alligator is so big, the plant goes like this, just like a flag. So this is actually a plant that's really helpful for swampers like me, because it's one of those telltale giveaways that can tell me, okay, there's something big around, right? And I can kind of tell through experience how big that something is by how much this plant is moving. So the common name is actually really, really appropriate.
Benji, I have 2 questions for you, not to interrupt, so I just don't forget. So they would like to know, they know there's alligators out there, but how common would it be while you're doing a swamp tromp like this to see them? And then the other question is, do any of the trees ever fall down from the deep water out there?
Do any of the what?
Trees.
The
fall
trees
down.
ever fall down?
So the trees do fall down, yes. And we're actually going to see one of those. In fact, there's another one right here. It's floating. And Sam, you can show this. This is probably a 30-foot section of log here that was hiding underwater. Now, it would be exceedingly rare for us to actually see an alligator while we're out here. And that's because as soon as they sense that we're here, and they can do that through sight, through sound, feeling vibrations of the water move, what they're going to do is they're going to go down to the bottom, they're going to stay there, and they're not going to bother us. So it would be really, really a rare thing if we were to see an alligator, especially close here in the swamp. Now, that being said, I have seen alligators when we're out here, generally when they're moving away from us. There's another stick.
That's always a good thing.
What's that?
That's always a very good thing.
So I wanted to see you guys to see kind of our trap setup here. So this is how we have them set up in the swamp. There's a tiny little fish in there. It just got out. So not successful because, yeah, we've got a lot of small fish in here. But we want to set these traps so that part of them stays above the water. And why would you guys guess the reason for that is?
Anybody have any guesses of why we leave it half or partially exposed?
So while you guys are thinking about that, I wanted to show you all some of the different epiphytes that we have here in the swamp. And this is one of the reasons that the swamp is one of my favorite habitats. I don't know if on the video you guys can see, but each one of these cypress trees, it's almost like its own ecosystem because it has so much life that is coming off of it. They all have all of these epiphytes. So epiphytes essentially are air plants. Okay, so they're these plants like this beautiful Tillandsia balbisiana. So this is one of our wild pine species. This is a common name. And you can see it's just attached to the cypress tree right here. And looking at some of the variation, I'm sure that a lot of you guys have seen this. This is Spanish moss. So you see this draped over oak trees and things like that. The Spanish moss is also a Tillandsia. It's in the same genus as this plant right here, and it's in the same genus as this plant down low. This is the common wild pine. So again, looks very different, but they're all epiphytes. They're all really closely related, and they all rely on this cypress tree as their home, right? And so this creates this relationship between two living things. And that relationship is called a symbiotic relationship, okay? It's when one species relies on another to survive. And so there's three kinds of symbiotic relationships. And Heather, I don't know if you guys have gone over those or if anybody might know what one of those.
Some of the students may know from past years, but it's not this early in the curriculum for our current year. But students on here would probably know from past years.
All right. And if you don't know, then you're going to look like rock stars in school later on. So the three different types of symbiotic relationships. There is, if nobody's going to guess, and to give you guys time to guess, did anybody have a guess on why we leave some of that trap out of the water? And if there wasn't, it's because we may catch animals that breathe air, things like frogs and snakes and turtles, maybe a really tiny turtle. But we leave a little bit of air on the top so that if we do catch one of those species, then they can still get up and breathe, and they'll be fine when we come and check on them.
Yep, and that was definitely in the chat. We definitely had students who guessed that. Awesome.
So the symbiotic relationships, there's three of them. There is mutualism, there is commensalism, and there's parasitism. Okay? So mutualism is when both species benefit. When one gets something positive from the other, and that works both ways. Commensalism is a relationship where one species benefits and the other one, it doesn't really mind. It's not harmed at all by the species who's benefiting from it being there. So a great example of that is, hopefully you guys know what gopher tortoises are. There are native tortoise here in Florida, and they dig these burrows. And they dig these burrows so that they can have this kind of climate controlled room to go hang out in. It's protection for them from predators. But there's a whole host of species that also use those burrows as homes. Things like indigo snakes and rattlesnakes and gopher frogs and different kinds of rodents, actually listed species here in Florida that are rare because they only use gopher tortoise burrows to live. And that's a commensal relationship. The gopher tortoise doesn't mind his neighbors being in there in the burrow with him, but they benefit greatly from that gopher tortoise.
Benji, you got about 14 minutes left, and I have a couple questions that I'd like to ask you before I forget them. One of them was, on the cypress trees, why is the bottom of the root so large? And then the other one, have any of you guys, while you're out on any of your eco adventures in any of your natural areas, gotten seriously hurt while you're doing your jobs?
Okay, so cypress trees, you remember the getting hurt question, okay?
Okay.
Because I'll forget. So cypress trees, why are they bigger at the base? While I'm explaining this, I want to ask you guys a question. With our tillandsias here, our wild pines, this Tillandsia balbisiana and the fasciculata, what kind of symbiotic relationship is this between them and the cypress tree? Okay, is it mutualism, is it commensalism, or is it parasitism? Now, the question was about these cypress trees and why they're bigger at the base. And the question is, or the answer is, science hasn't really proven that yet, but it definitely has to do with the amount of water that they're standing in. If you see a cypress tree that somebody planted in their yard, like I have, because I love cypress trees, but I don't live in a swamp, so it's really well-drained soil. I keep that tree alive with irrigation because otherwise it wouldn't be wet enough for it to survive. These things are evolved to live in water that's feet deep. That tree would never get a buttress, but these trees that are in the swamp, in the water, the base of them just expands and expands. And, the theory is it has something to do with allowing this plant to get oxygen to its roots. So all plants need to get oxygen to their roots. So plants that are in the swamp here have different adaptations to get water to the root system. Some of them put off what's called adventitious rooting, which means roots just come out of the trunk here at the water line so they can transfer oxygen. Cypress trees, they have these things called cypress knees as well. So there's not just the buttress, but there's also these cypress knees that are sticking up, like over here. And this is kind of like one of these mysteries of science, okay? Because it's thought that this has something to do with getting oxygen to the roots of these trees, but there have been research studies that have been done and scientific experiments, and nobody's been able to prove that that's actually what they do. If you cut these off, the wood that is in these cypress knees is really, really light. It's fibrous. It's like balsam wood. It's very different than the wood that's in the trunk of the trees. So that's kind of just goes to show, like, you kind of think we know everything, right, with the internet and all this information sharing. But the fact of the matter is there's so many mysteries that are still here for us to learn about. The buttressing on the cypress trees. Yeah.
How does global warming impact the swamp's ecosystem? Okay,
so that's a fantastic question. Before I answer that, I want to really quickly answer, has anyone ever been seriously injured? So Alicia, next up is global warming, effect on swamps. So serious injuries. Thankfully no. We had one of our staff actually slipped on a rock when we were doing a volunteer cleanup and had some nerve damage and was causing bad pain in her hip. So not what you're thinking, you know, some kind of predator took a limb off or something. No, it was a rock that she slipped on. That's right. That's right. We have had 2 students. Not sure why it keeps happening to students, but they were doing seagrass surveys in Lake Worth Lagoon, and they weren't doing the stingray shuffle. So twice in the last 8 years, we've had employees get stung by stingrays, which is an excruciating affair. So those are kind of the biggest ones. About 25 years ago, we had a couple of staff that got caught in one of these thunderstorms out on one of the boats, and the boat actually got struck by lightning and kind of stunned one of our biologists who still works with us, thankfully. So, you know, occasionally.
Was everybody okay on the boat?
Everybody's okay. Yes.
Okay.
And the boat was not okay, but everybody was okay on the boat. All right. So let's talk about global warming here. But before we get to that, did anybody have an answer on what kind of symbiotic relationship is this, where these epiphytes are hanging on to this cypress tree? They're using this cypress tree as a place to live. Even things like this lichen.
You had commensalism was one of the answers that was given.
Right. Yes. Commensalism. Exactly. Because these guys are getting a home. They're getting structure. But the cypress tree is not really getting anything from them. So I want to talk about global warming, and then maybe if we have time, we'll talk about a mutualistic relationship that's happening right here. And it's this beautiful pink dot that's right on the cypress tree. But to get to your question about global warming. So, yeah.
Will you also be able to show us the fallen cypress with the photosynthesis still occurring?
Oh, yeah. We're going to walk over there while we talk global warming. So global warming is essentially, you know, we don't have to deal with sea level rise where we are right now. However, what sea level rise is doing locally here is really causing issues with the Loxahatchee River. So, with sea level rise and with the anthropogenic effect of drainage, the Loxahatchee River is not only getting more salt water that's coming in the Jupiter Inlet because of sea level rise, but it also is not expelling as much fresh water. And what that's doing is if you paddle down the river from Riverbend Park all the way to Jonathan Dickinson State Park, you will see the habitat change from cypress, from freshwater, to more of an estuary with mangroves. And along the way, you will see the skeletons of cypress trees that have died off. And that is because that saltwater edge is moving further and further upstream. So it's actually replacing cypress habitat and cypress swamp with mangrove swamp. That's one of the ways that it's affecting it. The other way is we're getting these kind of radical changes in rainfall, right? So a great example is 2 years ago, 2018, we had a record wading bird nesting year in the Everglades. I mean, unbelievable nesting that was close to historic levels 80 years ago, like hundreds of thousands of nests. It was incredible, and the water was just right that year. But then last year was an awful year in the Everglades. And we actually had some nesting in some of our natural areas that was great because it helped to offset some of the devastating nesting effort in the Everglades. But what happened last year is, and we want to be careful, we don't want to point to a single event and say that was because of climate change. Like Hurricane Delta, you know, that was because of climate change. But what we can say is these storm events are getting stronger because of climate change, and the normal wet and dry seasons that we've been used to, we're not seeing as often anymore. So what happened last year is we had this wet season, which generally ends in November, and then we start this gradual drawdown. Well, in January, we had We had unbelievable rainfall in January of last year, and that filled all these wetlands up again. And so that screwed up a lot of the early wading bird nesting, like wood storks and ibis. They start nesting around that January time, and it's all based on that drawdown. Well, we had this crazy wet January, and that spiked water levels up. And unfortunately, there was thousands and thousands of chicks that didn't make it, that were already in the nest. But because of that insanely wet January, which was really abnormal, those wading birds that had started their nesting effort and had chicks in the nest couldn't then find enough food to feed their chicks. And so I think what we're going to see is we're going to see that happening more and more. We're going to get these irregular weather patterns, and it's probably going to end up impacting those nesting cycles that are more reliant on what they've evolved with as wet season, dry season, things like that. So that's really one of the ways that climate change is going to affect swamps and the animals that inhabit these systems. This is a really cool find, and we'll kind of end with this, unless you want me to go backstroke through the swamp or something. This cypress tree is not connected to anything. This log has likely fallen in a recent rainstorm. You see, there's no roots there, but it fell into the swamp. And part of this tree that got knocked over during one of these windstorms, it's still trying to survive. And you can see the branches are coming out of this cypress tree because of the energy it has in the core of the trunk right here. It's sending up these new shoots. It's getting water straight up the trunk because the trunk is in the water still. And so we'll see what happens. And really what this tree is trying to do is photosynthesize so it can try to create some more roots to put back down into the soil. So just kind of a really cool find that there's this log that, you know, if it wasn't propped up by this other fallen cypress tree over here, then it'd just be floating in the water. But because it fell and it's propped up here, it's shooting out these new leaves, it's photosynthesizing, and it's really, really trying to survive here. So something really, really cool. Heather, if we got one more minute, really quick, we'll talk about this cool pink lichen here.
Please, because the kids are asking all about that. They want to know if it was a rash, if it was paint. They want to know what that is.
It looks like paint, right? This is something called the Christmas lichen or the Baton Rouge lichen. It's fairly rare here in the swamp. You don't see a lot of it, but this is actually a mutualistic relationship between a fungus and cyanobacteria. Okay. And so what lichen are, and lichen, these pink things right here, this is a lichen, but these scalier things, these are also lichen, a different species of lichen. The white on the bark is another species of lichen. And lichens are this mutualistic relationship where the cyanobacteria, which creates this color, these different colors, it is what produces the food. It photosynthesizes. And so it takes in sunlight and produces food for this structure. But what provides the structure and kind of the house that these cyanobacteria live in is the fungus. So this is a relationship between two different species that absolutely could not survive on their own. So the fungus has built the house, providing the food for the fungus to be able to continue to build that house bigger and bigger. So just another one of these, amazing things that makes the swamp this just kind of prehistoric wonderland. So I love it. I really hope you guys have learned to love the swamp a little bit more on this field trip. We're going to be back. We're going to be putting our feet in the mud. We're going to be putting ourselves into some interesting situations here throughout the year. So I know that none of you were required to come and hang out with us today. But I know that, you have to do some of this enrichment material. I hope you guys have had fun. And I hope you guys have realized that our trips are a little different than field trips that you might have gone on in the past. We don't have a real set curriculum where we're going to go over things. My goal is to just take you guys out exploring with me because that's what I love to do. and we just kind of see what we find along the way. So Heather, we got anything else before we leave?
I don't think anything crucial. There's about 5 million questions that have been coming in, but you have no time to answer all that.
Okay. All right. So we'll be back next month. We're going to be on a different adventure, different habitat, probably still going to be muddy. I tend to like to do that. So hopefully you guys had fun. Tell your friends, this is an awesome way to get those enrichment hours.
Will you be coming back here at a different season?
And we will be coming back to a swamp, probably not this exact one, but to a swamp into the dry season when we can get some more of those fish and put a lot more of those critters in our hands. So we'll look for those opportunities. Thank you guys. I hope we see you next month. Heather,
and Benji, if anybody has any dire questions, can those students reach out to those teachers and those teachers get with me and then I shoot them to you and then we get those answers back to those students?
Absolutely, yes. And Heather, maybe a good reminder is we follow these field trips up by sending photos. We talked about the endangered Everglades snail kite, so we can send you some photos of snail kites. And then Anne, she's another one of our people behind the scenes here who makes this work. She's an amazing photographer, and she'll send some photos of some of the other things we talked about as well, so that you guys can get a really close view, not just this pixelated video that we're dealing with here. So Heather, do you have a way of sharing those photos?
Yes, I will get them to the teachers. Once I get the Google form filled out for the attendance today, I will send all those pictures to those teachers and they can share them with their schools and their students.
Yes, and if you guys have any questions that you really want answered, send them to your teacher. Heather will make sure that they get funneled over to us, and we'll be happy to answer anything you got.
All right, thank you. They're all very grateful for you doing this today. They thought this was very interesting, and they can't wait for next time, Benji. So thank you guys.
Awesome, thank you guys. Get outside and explore. It's awesome out here. We'll see you next time.
All right, thanks everybody. Please make sure you get that attendance form filled out. I am going to go ahead and put the QR code up on the screen as well. So if you would like to go ahead and take a picture using that, or not take a picture, but use your phone and scan that QR code, you can go ahead and scan it, or the attendance forms is in the chat as well. Thank you guys all for attending. Bye guys.